In August of 1883, under a sky the color of an old bruise, Elara stepped off the stagecoach into the dusty, rain-scented air of Dawson's Hollow, Montana territory. She clutched a worn carpet bag, a torn letter, and the hands of two children who held onto her skirts with wide, uncertain eyes. At 23, she was twice widowed and bone-weary, a fatigue so profound she felt it in every step. The town's residents watched her with the long memories and short patience typical of small towns. But Elara wasn't there for their kindness. She was there for Elias Thorne. He stood across the street, a tall and silent figure beside the livery barn. His arms were folded, a hat pulled low over his dark eyes, his coat clean and his boots polished. His stillness was louder than the clatter of the horses behind her. Everyone in Dawson's Hollow knew him, the Thorne boy who struck gold before 25, who turned cattle into a fortune, and who had refused every woman who tried to tame him. He had money, land, a voice like gravel, but no wife and no heirs. That was, until now. Elara squared her shoulders, looked him dead in the eye, and walked directly across the muddy road. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling knees. "You need a wife or a witness." The silence that followed was long and thick. A storm cracked somewhere to the east, but Elias didn't flinch. He looked down at the two children at her side, 6-year-old Vera with her mother's sharp jaw and a streak of dust on her nose, and 4-year-old Leo, his small hand gripped tightly in his sister's 6. His gaze returned to Elara. "That depends," he said slowly. "What exactly do you mean by that?" she asked. She pulled a folded paper from her bag, a deed to land her late husband had bought and died trying to defend. The neighboring ranch owner, a man with influence over the county judge, claimed the land was theirs. This was the same ranch that had burned her barn and threatened to return if she didn't leave. "I need someone who can stand beside me in court," she explained. "They won't listen to a woman. They won't listen to a poor widow, but they will listen if I am a thorn." "You think marrying me will fix that?" he asked. "I think marrying you is the only way they won't steal what little I have left." Elias studied her for a long time. "You're not from here. You have nothing but these two and a name I'm trying to keep clean." "I don't want a wife," she countered, her voice rising, a flush of heat in her cheeks. "And I don't want a husband, but I will not run again. I'm done running." A gust of wind whipped her hair across her face. Vera clung tighter to her skirt, and Leo stared up at Elias as if he were a statue come to life. Finally, Elias said, "Come with me." He turned and walked toward the church at the end of the street. She hesitated for only a moment before following her children silently beside her. Inside, the preacher was sweeping the front pews. Elias spoke 3 simple words: "We need vows." The old man blinked, dropped his broom, and reached for his Bible. There was no kiss, no ring, just words, silence, the quiet sniffling of Vera from the front pew, and the sound of Leo gnawing on the corner of a hymn book. When it was done, Elias turned to her and said, "You are a thorn now." And that was how it began. He gave them 2 rooms in his house, one for her and one for the children. He didn't touch her or ask questions. He rode out every morning before dawn, returning home smelling of leather and pine. At supper he sat quietly, while the children chattered, and Elara served beans and cornbread. At night, she lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. The house was too big, too quiet, but it was safe. A week passed, then 2. One night, as she folded laundry by the hearth, he came in. His shirt was torn, and there was blood on his sleeve. She dropped the cloth. "What happened?" "Fence dispute," he said simply, wincing as he pulled the shirt over his head. "Someone thinks I'm getting too close to the East Ridge." Without thinking, she grabbed a basin and a cloth, kneeling beside him. "Sit," she said. He did. She cleaned the wound, her fingers brushing against the thick muscle of his arm. He watched her, his eyes dark under the brim of his hat. "You shouldn't get involved in my troubles," he said quietly. "You married me." "I didn't marry you for this." She looked up at him. "Then why did you?" He didn't answer. Later that night, after the children were asleep, She found him on the porch, staring at the stars. She stood beside him, close enough to feel his warmth through her nightdress. "Have you ever been in love, Mr. Thorne?" "No," he said. She smiled faintly. "Me neither." He really looked at her then, and something shifted. The next day, he took her to the courthouse and sat beside her while the judge read the deed and then the forged one the neighbors had brought. When the judge ruled in her favor, the room erupted in whispers. Outside, Elias turned to her. "That land is yours now." She nodded. "We both know they won't stop." "No," he said, "they won't." That night, she found him on the porch again. This time, she brought a blanket and sat down right beside him. "You could have turned me away," she said. "I thought about it," he said. "Then I saw those kids, and I saw you." He didn't say more, but he didn't have to. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't move away, and for the first time in a long while, Alara let herself breathe. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something steady, something warm, and it was theirs. By early September, the cottonwoods along the creek behind the Thorne Ranch had begun to yellow, and the mornings carried a bite that warned of snow. Alara rose before the sun most days. It wasn't a chore. The quiet hours with her hands in hot water gave her space to think. Vera helped gather kindling without being asked, and Leo clung to his wooden horse as if it could carry the weight of the world. Elias left most mornings without a word, but returned every time before dusk. That in itself was a kind of promise. One evening, after the children were asleep and the coals in the hearth glowed low, Elias knocked once on her bedroom doorframe. He didn't enter. "I'm riding to Anaconda tomorrow," he said. "Won't be back till after sundown." She folded her hands in her lap. "Business. Bank's transferring ownership papers on a herd I bought up north. Need my name on the line." She nodded. "Do you want me to pack food?" He hesitated. "I want you to come." Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the suddenness of it. "Why?" she asked. "I figure it's time you saw what's yours, too." They didn't speak again that night, but before dawn, Vera helped her braid her hair, and Leo insisted on carrying the small satchel Elias had left for them by the door. The buggy was hitched and ready, and Elias stood beside it, his coat buttoned to the neck, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his eyes. The ride to Anaconda took most of the day. The land unspooled around them rolling hills that turned to pine-thick foothills, then opened into a patchwork of gold and rust where the mining town rose from the earth like a scar stitched over with ambition. Smoke curled from chimneys, and men moved like ants along scaffolds and rail lines. Alara kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I've never been in a place so loud with so little said." Elias gave a quiet grunt. "Most men here come to get rich or get buried. Both, if they stick around long enough." The bank sat on a corner of Main Street, a 2-story brick building with iron bars over the windows and a polished door that looked too fine for the dust it faced. Inside, the clerk greeted Elias nervously. While they waited, Alara wandered to the window. Across the street, a woman with a fine parasol and an even finer expression whispered something to her companion and looked straight at her. Alara held her gaze, then turned away. Minutes later, Elias set a hand low on her back. "It's done." Outside, she asked, "What do you mean to do with the cattle?" "Split the herd. Bring half down to the lower pasture near your land. Let them graze through winter if the snow holds off." She looked up at him. "You say your land like it's not yours too." "It's in your name. That's not the same." He didn't answer. Instead, he helped her into the wagon, his hands steady at her waist, lingering just a second longer than they needed to. Her heart beat faster for reasons that had nothing to do with the ride home. They stopped once, on the way back near a patch of aspens, where the leaves shivered like coins. She laid out bread and cold ham, and the children chased each other in wide, clumsy circles. Elias leaned against a tree and watched them. "Vera's sharper than most grown men I know," he said. "She's had to be," Alara replied. He looked at her then, not with that guarded distance from before, but with something quieter, more knowing. "You kept them fed, safe. Somehow I didn't see another choice." "You think anyone who survived had more than that?" She didn't answer. The wind stirred her skirt, and the sun slipped behind a cloud, briefly dimming the world. That night, as they returned to the ranch, with Leo long since asleep on the seat between them, Elias spoke without turning his head. "I didn't marry you for your trouble," he said, "but I'm not walking away from it either." She looked at him, her throat tight. "And what about the rest of it?" He paused. "You talking about the part where we share a name but not a life? I'm talking about the part where maybe I want more than silence in separate rooms." He didn't speak right away. Then he said, "I never figured myself for someone who deserved more than silence." The wagon rolled on, wheels crunching over the gravel path. She didn't push. He'd said what he could. But later, as she tucked Vera in beneath the quilt she'd sewn from scraps back in Colorado, Elias appeared in the doorway, holding a carved wooden box. He placed it on the small table beside the hearth. "What is it?" she asked. "Belonged to my mother. She kept keepsakes in it, ribbons, letters, bits of lace." He paused. "I thought maybe you'd want it for things that matter." Elara opened the lid. It smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. She looked up, and for the first time, Elias didn't look away. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "I'll see you in the morning." And just before he turned, his fingers brushed hers a touch, nothing more. But the quiet between them had changed. It held more than distance now. It held possibility. The first frost came overnight, unannounced, lacing the water pails with thin glass and turning the breath of cattle into slow clouds. Elara woke to the sound of boots on the porch and found a bucket of split wood stacked neatly beside the door. Not a word was left with it. Just care quiet and practical. She lit the stove and stirred cornmeal into a pot, while Vera sat stitching a hem by the window. Leo lay on his stomach in front of the hearth, drawing patterns in the ash with a stick. They were settled, not yet rooted, but something close. The knock came mid-morning. It wasn't Elias's. It was louder, sharper. Elara cracked the door. A man stood on the step, his long coat streaked with trail dust, a pistol holstered at his hip. His face looked like it had been carved by wind and tempered by whiskey. Behind him, 2 horses pawed the hard ground. "You Mrs. Thorne?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "I'm not here for trouble," he added, eyeing the children through the gap in the door. "Name's Seth. I rode with Elias back when the Bitterroot herd got taken by those Pike boys. He around?" "He's out checking the north fence." "I'll wait." She stepped aside. He didn't come in. He just leaned against the porch post and pulled an apple from his coat pocket, biting into it as if he had all the time in the world. "You want one?" she asked. "Nah. But I owed him, and I pay my debts." He tossed the core into the dirt. He sent word about that boundary survey. There was a letter from Helena. Said the new lines are being drawn before first snow. Seth gave a single nod. "That'll stir the hornets." Elara crossed her arms. "They've been stirred." He tilted his head. "You always this calm, or just when cornered?" "I don't rattle easy." He studied her a moment longer. "He told me he married. Didn't say she had iron under her skin." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. When Elias returned, he showed no surprise at the sight of Seth on his porch. He just handed off his gloves and told him supper would be ready when it was ready. That night, the 3 of them sat around the table while Vera read aloud from a tattered almanac and Leo dozed against Elias's side. After the children had been carried to bed, Elara lingered by the sink, drying her hands slowly. Elias leaned against the doorframe. "You trust him?" she asked quietly. "About as far as you can trust a man who's been shot twice and lived both times." "That's not an answer." Elias's gaze met hers. "He saved my life once. That's enough." She nodded, drying the same plate twice. "He said something about a survey. I was waiting to tell you. If the new line holds, your property is going to run clear to the ridge. That gives you water access, grazing rights, and more to defend." He stepped into the room, took the plate from her hands, and set it down. "You're not defending it alone." She looked up at him. "I don't know what this is between us, Elias, but I'm not looking for a shadow to stand behind." "You're not behind me. Then where am I?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out slowly and touched her wrist, his fingers warm and solid. Ilara's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. I'm not good at leaning on people. You don't have to lean. Just don't walk off. Outside, Seth's voice rose in a song, tuneless and low. Somewhere in the fields, a coyote yipped once, then fell silent. Elias's hand slid from her wrist to her palm. I married you for a reason. You asked if I needed a wife or a witness. Truth is, I needed both. Still do. She turned her hand, lacing her fingers with his. I didn't come here looking for a man. I came looking for a way to stop running. He stepped closer, the air between them warm despite the chill seeping through the window panes. You found one. That night, for the first time, she didn't close her door behind her. When he passed the children's room, he paused to tuck the quilt tighter around Leo, then turned and followed her upstairs. No words, just the sound of stairs creaking under shared weight and the long exhale of two people who had stopped pretending they weren't hoping for more. The ice on the pails would melt by noon. The wind would rise again. But in that room, with the door open and the fire banked low, something steady took root. Not rushed, not declared, but simply there, and it would hold. By mid-October, the wind had grown restless, peeling leaves from the cottonwoods and driving the horses into the lower pasture before dusk. The days shortened with a kind of urgency, and the evenings arrived with long shadows and the smell of chimney smoke. Ilara had taken to mending by lamplight, while Vera recited her letters aloud, and Leo fell asleep with his face pressed into her side. Elias had started keeping a ledger open on the table after supper, scratching figures by firelight. He wrote with his left hand, the knuckles scarred and precise. Ilara didn't ask about the ink-stained pages, but she watched how his brow creased when the numbers didn't balance. One night, without looking up, he asked, You ever worked a branding iron? She looked up from the stitching in her lap. I've mended wounds caused by one. Does that count? He gave a quiet sound, neither laughter nor agreement. The North herd's ready to mark. Could use someone who doesn't flinch. I'll come. They left before the frost had lifted, Elias on horseback and Ilara seated behind him, her skirt bundled high enough for the stirrups. The children stayed with the preacher's wife, who didn't ask questions once Elias handed her a sack of flour and a jar of molasses. The branding pen sat in a hollow past the high ridge, where the wind cut sharp and the cattle lowed like a slow river. Two hired men waited with iron and rope, their jackets patched and their expressions flat. Ilara nodded once at them and said nothing more. When Elias handed her the iron, she didn't grip it like something foreign. She turned it in her hand until the weight fit. The calves bawled and kicked, and the smoke rose clean into the sky. She didn't waver. Later, when the sun hung low and the last calf limped back into the herd, Elias handed her a canteen. His gloves were blackened, his jaw marked by dust and ash. You didn't hesitate, he said. I've done harder things for less reason. He studied her, then pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. I put your name on the cattle record. I thought they'd run under Thorne. They do, but I wrote it out. Ilara Fremont Thorne in full. She stared at the paper, then at him. Why? Because a witness signs once. A wife signs again and again, every time something's built. She lowered her eyes to the paper. That's not something most men would think to say. I'm not most men. No, she said. You're not. They rode back in silence. At the house, Vera rushed into her arms, her cheeks cold and bright. Leo tugged at Elias's coat until he was lifted high, his boots swinging above the floorboards. That night, as Ilara combed Vera's hair, the girl asked, Did you ride far today? Far enough, Ilara said. But not so far I couldn't find my way back. Downstairs, Elias stood at the window, watching the wind push across the fields. When she joined him, he didn't turn. Seth left this morning, he said. Didn't say where, just left a coin on the porch rail. Ilara folded her arms. Does he strike you as the kind who leaves for good? number, but he won't come back unless there's cause. She watched the dark stretch between the barn and the fence line. Then, let's make sure there's no reason for him to. Elias looked at her then, his eyes steady. I've been thinking about the back room. Could knock out the wall, make space for a loom or whatever you need. I don't need a loom. You might want one. She turned toward him, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. What I want is to wake up beside someone who doesn't disappear when the sun rises. He stepped closer, the space between them smaller than it had ever been. I'm not going anywhere, Elara. She didn't answer, only reached up, touching his jaw with the back of her hand. He closed his eyes, just once. When she kissed him, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, rooted, the kind of kiss that came from long silences and shared burdens. He didn't rush it. He simply held her, one hand on her waist, the other at the small of her back, like he'd always known where it should go. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the rhythm there. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking loose the last of the leaves. But inside, it was warm. Inside, it was home. A hard snow came early that November, thick and wet, weighing down the roof of the smokehouse and icing over the pump handle. Elias spent the better part of 2 days rigging a second lean-to for the cattle and laying straw in the barn loft where the cold crept in, no matter how tight the boards were nailed. Elara kept the kitchen warm with stew and biscuits, the smell of bay leaf and brown flour clinging to the walls like comfort. The rhythm of the house had changed. There were no doors left closed between them. When Elias stepped inside at evening, he brought the cold with him, but it never stayed long. He carved blocks of wood by the fire, while Vera read aloud from an old tale of kings and forests the preacher's wife had lent her. Leo drifted to sleep curled beneath a quilt Elara had finished just the week before. One morning, Elias brought back a letter from the post office in Deer Hollow. He handed it to Elara without a word. The seal was cracked, and the paper soft at the edges, but the handwriting was her uncle's, the only blood she had left in Kentucky. She read it at the table, her lips pressed tight. They want Vera and Leo, she said finally. Says they've got kin willing to take them in. Says it'd be better for them to grow up among proper folk. Elias didn't speak. I won't send them, she added, folding the letter slowly. Even if the name on that paper carries more weight than mine ever did back east. She looked at her hands, at the way she kept them still, though her jaw worked as if she were biting something bitter. I know what it means to be unwanted, she said. I won't let them feel that. Not ever. Elias nodded once. Then, they stay. She looked up then. They're mine now, too. She didn't cry. She just reached over, laid her hand on top of his, and left it there. That winter settled hard. The sky stayed gray for weeks, and the creek froze shallow. There were days the wind howled so loud, it felt like the house itself braced against it. But inside, it was steady. Elara taught Vera to knit, and Elias showed Leo how to oil the saddle straps. They made a life from the quiet things, shared chores, long evenings, and hands brushed together over the bread bowl. One afternoon, Elias returned from the South Ridge with a limp and blood darkening his trouser leg. She met him halfway across the yard, steadying him with one hand while he waved off her concern. Snagged it on barbed wire, he muttered. Fool thing. Sit down before you fall down, she said, guiding him toward the bench by the pump. She cut the fabric, cleaned the gash, and wrapped it tight. He winced once, then went still. You don't have to do this, he said. You're my husband. I mean, all of it. The land, the cold, me. She looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. I want to. He studied her, and something in his face softened. I don't know what I did to deserve that. You stayed, she said. He reached up, touching her cheek with his calloused fingers. You made this place feel like more than dirt and fence posts. You made it feel like home. That night, she crawled into bed beside him without hesitation. The wind rattled outside, but inside it was warm. He tucked her against him, his arm around her waist, his breath slow against her neck. Spring came late. The thaw was slow, and the field stayed slick with mud until April. But when the first crocus pushed through the soil behind the barn, Ilara knelt to touch it like something holy. Vera planted peas in neat rows, careful with the seeds. Leo chased the chickens with a stick until Elias taught him how to scatter feed instead. On the morning of their first anniversary, Elias saddled 2 horses and left a note on the table. Back by dusk. Feed the hens. Ilara found him by the ridge where the boundary line met the edge of the pine stand. He'd built a bench there, plain but sturdy. From the seat, you could see the whole stretch of their land fields greening, fences mended, the roof of the house catching sunlight between the hills. "I wanted you to see it from here," he said, offering her his hand. She sat beside him, letting the silence settle the way it always did between them, peaceful and earned. "This was never the life I pictured," she said, watching the wind bend the tall grass. "Me neither," he said, "but I'd choose it every time." He turned toward her. "I love you, Ilara." She smiled. "I know." He kissed her slowly, one hand on her cheek, the other at her back, anchoring them both. They stayed until the sun dipped low, then rode home together, the horses moving easy beneath them. Years passed. The children grew tall and sure-footed. Vera took to reading law books she borrowed from the circuit judge's daughter, and Leo could rope a calf before he turned 12. Ilara planted herbs behind the house, and Elias built her a second stove for soap making. They never spoke of the years before, not out of shame, but because they didn't need to. What they had now was enough. One morning, long after the warblers returned and the creek ran full again, Ilara stood on the porch, her hands cradling her belly. Elias came up behind her, his arms slipping around her waist. "Boy or girl?" he asked. She leaned back into him. "Doesn't matter." He kissed her temple. "We'll love him just the same." And they would, because some lives weren't built in grand moments, but in the quiet choosing of each other over and over, day by day. And that's what they did. Always.